Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here, and I would like to also say hello to our online audience. Good afternoon from Stockholm, and very much welcome to the second session of the SIWI Seminar on Innovation and the Geopolitics of Water. You may have heard about the SIWI Seminars. They are organized by members of the Scientific Program Committee. It's a group of different experts who work and support the World Water Week with the overall theme. And I think now we have about 10 seminars. And it is my great pleasure to work on this committee together with Aaron Salzberg, who is also supporting this session, and Lama Ranjus and Olivia Schad. Lama and Olivia are young scientific program committee members who are supporting our work. And I can tell you, we've been working on preparing this seminar for over a year. And aside of that, we were very fortunate to have 4 amazing co-conveners: the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs and the Finnish Water Forum, the International Crisis Group, the United States Institute of Peace, and also the World Meteorological Organization. So we together in this group, we were putting together this program. And maybe you followed our online session, the first session of this series yesterday, where we heard very interesting news from the private sector that really showed commitments to make as much data open source. So we really heard these commitments that the private sector would like to see that a lot of data is becoming publicly available. But this also brings other questions. It brings questions related to the ethical code. It brings questions about standardization. And in this session today, we would like to move the discussion a little bit away from the data technology, more to the geopolitics and understand the connection. Because as you can imagine, making data open source or publicly accessible, it can change many negotiation processes in shared waters, in transboundary basins. And we would like to better understand these impacts. Just think about how big role data sharing plays in different processes, and this can really be a game changer. So that's why we have this session, to really better understand this. And now it is a great pleasure to introduce our Toastmaster or moderator of the whole session, Antti Rautavaara, from the happiest country in the world, from Finland. Antti is the special envoy for water working at the Finnish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. So now, Antti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martina. Can I just check if it's working right? Good. Geopolitics, it's madness, right? Just think of Russian aggression in Ukraine. Think of Kakhovka, where water became a weapon of war. So it's quite simple that we just talk about madness where water is involved. I came to think that word because I was listening a band called Madness this morning on my way to Stockholm, and they have a song called House of Fun. And I started to think the lyrics there, and it says that welcome to the lion's den. Welcome to the House of Fun. And somehow I thought that this is actually this session also, because we want to have the difficult topics on discussion, but then again, this is Stockholm, so this should be fun. This is not a negotiation of governments. So when geopolitics really is, if ever, is a topic where everyone is happy, as we Finns tend to be, or in agreement with their neighbors, that's why the lyrics. And now we start off with 2 opening statements, and then those are followed with 2 case studies. And we did not pick the Finland-Sweden river basin, which is shared, because we thought that, it's not very disputed. Maybe it was 200 years ago, but not anymore. So we have 2 case studies presented by academics. One is the Helmand River from the Afghanistan, and I need to check my notes. Sorry, Iran, Afghanistan, River, and then the other one is Eastern Nile with Egyptian, Sudanese, Ethiopian context. So disputed river bases, and let's sort of think about those, and then the innovation as well as the water diplomacy, how that all plays out in those regions. So let's dive into it. But before that, I do want to say thank to all of the team that has been preparing for this series of sessions, especially Lama Ranjus, Olivia Shad, Kira Heikelä, Saara Leppänen, Inkeri Kolman, and Virpi Turunen. Other ones I will forget if I don't do it immediately. So we start off with opening statement coming from a very seasoned diplomat, Mrs. Katja Alfors. She's a director of Peace Mediation Center in the Finnish Foreign Ministry. She was previously in the Foreign Minister Pekka Haavisto's cabinet, and she's been in several postings, but she's been posted at least to Brussels, to Addis Ababa, and also here in Stockholm. So please, Katja, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Yes, it's on. Thank you, Antti, and a warm welcome to all of you, both online and on site. And here on site, what an honor and what a pleasure to see that this room is more or less sold out. So I would also like starting by thanking our co-conveners and co-organizers. You have clearly done a great job by attracting so many people here. The context of this session is worrying. SDG 6 on water and sanitation is alarmingly off track. I'm sure you all know that. And it was very clearly shown in the recently published synthesis report. But actually already the previous report from 5 years back gave a strong message on this. And since then, unfortunately, but not surprisingly, due both to climate change and conflicts, the situation has deteriorated further. As was strongly stated in today's high-level opening session, only through cooperation can we achieve a water-wise world. And I hope that today's discussion will contribute one part into that very wide picture. By now, it is a well-established fact that in the future, water will be the most important geopolitical resource. It is a strategic and indispensable resource and an essential element of national and regional security. Nowhere on this planet can anyone live without water resources. In today's world, this means that pressures are mounting also on transboundary basins, and possibly increasing the risk of conflict. And to avoid such disputes, the international community has agreed on water conventions. UN water conventions, together with customary international law, set out principles for transboundary water cooperation. This kind of cooperation actually often continues during armed conflict and can thus act as a driver for peace. The principles of international water law, such as equitable and reasonable utilization of water resources, are also important elements in peace agreements. As in many other areas, preventive work is highly valuable and can yield good results. Still, the work that we do in water during conflict can play a major role in achieving peace. Classical example in this is in Israel, Jordan, and I trust that we will hear several other experiences during today's session. Ladies and gentlemen, in Finland, we're committed to making use of technology, digital solutions, and innovation in our international water cooperation. Modern technology and innovations are needed to, for example, enhance the efficiency of water use and ensure sustainable water management, particularly in areas facing water stress and in transboundary basins. This may include artificial intelligence, remote sensing, digital solutions, and Earth observations, as well as innovative techniques, while also integrating traditional knowledge. And in this regard, I think we heard some really interesting remarks this morning or earlier today. Open data is also key for cooperation and democratization of the water diplomacy sphere. Water is geopolitics. Diplomacy, including peace mediation, is not anymore taking place only behind closed doors. Through the change in the technological sphere, data can be openly shared and more democratic, and online platforms can create venues for open public discussion and possibilities for new actors to engage. This is the new reality, bringing along great opportunities, but also challenges that we must be sensitive to. We cannot afford being naive. Digital tools can contribute to a more transparent and strengthened transboundary water cooperation, and innovations and technology can bring great benefits to peace mediation processes. But we must also be aware of the challenges that new technologies and real-time access to data can bring along. So efforts need to be taken to ensure that these new tools and digitalizations do not jeopardize human rights or democratic development. We believe we must support strengthening of digital skills and the development of solutions that are suitable to local conditions. Women, youth, and vulnerable groups like people with disabilities suffer the most when safe water and sanitation are lacking due to conflicts. It is important that these people are not only to be protected, but also fully included in solving these situations. And here, I really would like to make a reference to what we heard earlier about the valuable experience and knowledge that indigenous people possess. I think that's a thing that will be a theme during these days, and I really look forward to hearing more about it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure our speakers will leave us inspired and enlightened about both the opportunities and the challenges related to the geopolitics of water. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Katja. And next speaker, we have Adam Maher from Ursa Space. Adam Maher is the CEO and founder of Ursa Space Systems, Inc., whose satellite analytics services enable users to monitor, search, and discover changes in physical objects around the globe. And I keep today the presentations very short so that we reserve time for the discussion. So, Adam, online, welcome to the session. Floor is yours.
Cool. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me today to speak on this important topic. I think while we bring up the slides here, so just first, wanted to thank the sponsors for inviting Ursa Space to speak here, because I think for us in our mission, this is really important to us. How do we illuminate the physical world and daily actions? And I think in the previous one we talked about, there's Earth observation, there's all these new technologies, but one of the things that is really important about this new technology, and that one of the things that we do, is how do you take and really orchestrate all these new Earth observation satellites, right? There's over 200 of these Earth observation satellites. They're up there, but the data coming from them can be complicated. And so when you actually try to talk about that topic of how do you actually have enable not just government users or analysts who are used to this, but how do you actually enable the rest of these users, whether, so for example, we just had a case, a water case actually, where we looked at a facility, that facility was drawing too much groundwater. And so there was so many elements of that, right? And how that can affect a geopolitical situation. You had farmers on the ground who were having issues with their crops. You had a corporation who was an international corporation and wanted to be a responsible citizen. And so they wanted to make sure their local entity wasn't doing anything that would harm. And then, but then there's also the government who wanted to make sure they regulate these new situations that are coming in. And so that's just like one simple case of how, by orchestrating and using these Earth observation satellites, we're able to actually start to bring that data, make it usable to a number of individuals. So if we go to the next slide. And so on this slide, when it comes to water, so specifically our company, we actually specialize in radar and using non-optical techniques. And so the reason we use radar, especially if you think about water, right? Radar sees through clouds, sees at night, and what allows us to really, track those changes independent of what that cloud condition is. And I'll talk about that in a minute with the Nile River and why that was really important. But if we look at this particular area here, there's, what can we do with this technology? And so when we start looking at this technology, we can start thinking about river flooding, reservoir fills, you have the lake surface, flood extent, how is the edges of, land versus water changes, everything from storm surge, water pollutants, dam breaking. So it's a really great technology. It allows you to really start to look in all sorts of different ways. And the great thing about this is because we're looking at this from space, you're not relying on having to be local into the ground. You can start to see that overall view of what's happening on Earth versus just in your one little area that you may be focused on. So let's go to the next slide. And actually, let's look at a case study. And this is one that was referred to earlier when we talked about the Ethiopian and Egypt water usage in the Nile, right? So in this particular example, what you're seeing here is I'm going to show you two parts. So this is, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept of lead and lag signals and how does that change your reaction to these events. So in this case, what you're seeing here on the screen is, these are three different, images of that particular dam, starting, one was June, July, well, 2 in July. And what you can see here is this dam here that's on the Nile is actually starting to be filled. And as it's starting to be filled, what you can see here is that's really going to change that the tension there, right? Because you have this, it's a controversial project. You got Ethiopia against its downriver neighbor, Egypt. Both of these countries are framing this issue in existential terms. They're both looking at, there's economic issues, there's water security issues. And so when we start looking at this, how can we start using this data to prevent that conflict? I think it's really about understanding, what is really happening versus, necessarily the rhetoric that can happen. And especially now when we think about, we will look at news, social media, other aspects that are happening in the conversation that can bring some noise to this. Really being able to measure what is actually happening on the ground brings a lot of, what it does is it brings a factual base from which, and various entities that are involved in this can actually then discuss, what is happening, what that impact is. So here what you can see is we're starting to see the fill of the dam. And, as we keep looking at this, we can, since we're able to see through clouds, we can keep continually monitoring this. Now, there's a lot of questions here about, when is it going to fill? When are the gates open? When are they not open? If you're using some other technology, let's say optical, or you're trying to actually put a person on the ground, that may not be possible, whether for geopolitical reasons or for just weather reasons. Like, so for example, in this particular area, you would have had to wait till August at least in order to actually have a cloud-free image of this part of the world. And so a lot of the areas where there's the most water, clouds are a big issue. So we look at this and we start to see this is monitoring, this is starting to fill, and this is actually going to take years to fill. And it's actually going to take years for us to really start, as we look upstream, we can start looking at the Nile River basin, and we can start seeing how does that impact any sort of agriculture into the future. But by measuring the change in flow now, you can start predicting where that's going to be a change in agriculture into the future. Now we look at this, and so I already started to talk about here, you can look at the now, and then but this is a leading indicator to what's going to happen in agriculture and in Egypt into the future. But if we go to the next slide, one thing that we do a lot, we find with water resources, is it's not just about looking at the water itself. It's about looking at other elements around the water that's happening. So a lot of times, if we think about whether it's dam construction, when we're asked to look at water resources, whether it's looking at dam construction, it's looking at the stability of the land around areas, looking at these other elements. The human activity that causes that actually starts quite a long ways before you actually have that impact, from the water change itself. So, for example, here, this particular dam had to be constructed, and so one thing that we actually do quite a bit, and we look at, when we're looking at ways to get ahead of these things, potential impacts to water, is actually measuring the human activity, whether it's the construction, the buildup of human, it could be the construction, could be the buildup of human activity around a particular area, that could, signal that, hey, there may be something that's going to happen here a few years down the road. And so what that does is it gives us time in order to really start to address these issues before, at this point, like this dam, it's already built, it's already starting to change the water condition, versus, monitoring the progress of this before, you can start to have years of time to really start to understand that. So if we go to the next example we have here on the next slide, this is another example. This is a recent example, another dam, but this dam is actually in Ukraine. And so this is the one that you probably have all seen that happened on the news. And so what I wanted to bring this one up here, and that what we're looking at here is now you have, in this case, we had a dam collapse. And, when that dam collapsed, there's the initial part of it, which makes the news, right? There's all the flooding, there's all the, there's the damage, there's the, just all the environmental impacts that are going to happen and human impacts that are going to happen. Well, the long-term story here, and a lot of the reason that we're actually, the groups that we're working with, is we're actually looking at this from an agricultural perspective. We're looking at this and saying, okay, as this dam was a really important source of water to support a significant amount of agriculture. And so, a lot of, as there's, this particular dam, right? When you think about that irrigation and what it's doing for, all the countries around there, there's this whole humanitarian aspect of, okay, so if we're not irrigating plants, where does the water come from for that food? Well, what's really happening is, what we're doing now is we start to think about going, forward here. Now we can measure what is the actual loss of water. But what we can do is we can also start to measure and look at what is the impact going to be on the farming as well. And so what that does for, groups that we work with, they're looking, again, they're looking at this and saying, okay, it's not an impact to food today, but 3 to 6 months from now, it will be an impact for food. And so there's a number of organizations that we work with, by taking this data, by having this information, they can make the decision that says, we need to go actually start diversifying where various food crops come from, such that, in 4 to 6 months from now, we don't have as big a crisis as it could have been, had we not known the full impact of this ahead of time. And so that's where we look at, I think when we look at the geopolitical landscape, for us, when we've been working with individuals, is by orchestrating the access to this great data, making it accessible to analysts who are experts in these various fields. What we can do for these water issues is we can really start thinking about, how do we have a factual basis for individuals, whether they're companies, whether they're governments, or whether they're actually like the individuals that are impacted, to have that conversation around without as much of the emotion. And then the second,
we are starting to run out of time, so one more minute.
Yep, and then the very last point here is, by being able to measure a number of these impacts, that may be far away from you, what you can do is you can actually then start to plan ahead and have that conversation before it becomes a crisis in your country or in your area, so as to really mitigate those impacts. And again, thank you for taking the time to look at here. And more, if you have any questions in the future, please reach out to us. We monitor water events around the world daily, and these these reports you're saying, these take us a few hours to produce, and we can then deliver that to the to really help inform decision making. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Adam. So next we have two case studies. The first one is innovative approaches in addressing the conflict in the Helmand River Basin. And I welcome Mr. Mohad Faizi on the podium. Mohad Faizi is a research advisor at the IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. His work focused on water and environment governance in fragile state and its security implications. Prior to joining IHE, he worked as a senior diplomat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Afghanistan. Please. Can you take it closer? Right. Switch on.
Yeah. I will talk about the Helmand River Basin, which is one of the most contentious river basin shared between Iran and Afghanistan. In a recent event on May 27th, by a cross-border clash, 2 guards from Iran and 1 border guard from Afghanistan died and several were injured. Taliban cited the drought as a reason for not being able to provide Iran water rights, while Iran publishing the satellite imagery of the reservoirs on the Helmand River inside Afghanistan, saying that there is water, but Taliban have blocked it behind the dams. Similarly, the expert from both sides, and these are just examples, for example, the expert from Afghanistan using satellite imagery mentioned that the Taliban have opened the gates of the dams inside Afghanistan and water is flowing towards Iran and the irrigation canals are closed, but it doesn't reach Iran due to high evapotranspiration. Similar contrary arguments were made by Iranian experts using satellite imagery and saying that water is diverted to irrigation canals, that's why it doesn't reach Iran. While the conflict in the Helmand River Basin precedes Taliban, there are 2 important factors in which intensified the conflicts between the 2 countries. One is the Kamal Khan Dam, as you can see on the map. It was built a few months prior to Taliban takeover near the Iranian border. And the dam has the capacity to divert water inside Afghanistan and only allow regulated flow towards Iran. The second was, which was also important, and I was part of this negotiations, was a negotiation over strategic agreement, which covered the issue of water, but also security, refugee, and economic cooperation. That process has collapsed with the collapse of the previous government. As you can see here, there are 4 artificial lakes or reservoirs built on Iranian side. These lakes provided Iran and the Sistan region, Iran, with a sustainable water supply throughout the year when the river is dry and to be used for agriculture and water supply, urban water supply. These lakes have almost diminished. And once they are completely dried, the water supply to Sistan region of Iran would be completely dependent on the water flow of the Helmand, which is subject to high variation and impact of climate change, but also to the managerial capacity of the Taliban. That leads to increased uncertainty and anxiety inside Iran. But there is a treaty between 2 countries, which both sides have emphasized in implementing. The treaty is envisage a very simple water allocation mechanism. It allocates 14.6% of the total flow of the river to Iran in a normal year. Normal year will be defined based on the data from Dehraoud station, which is a red circle on the top, and the delivery will be done in 3 points across in the joint border. Currently, none of these exist. While Dehraoud is in place, the 3 points where the delivery of the water rights should be done, they don't exist. And also the treaty provides a monthly timetable based on which the Iran water rights have to be delivered. So this the disagreement over water rights, the amount of the flow and the water rights of Iran, and also the amount of the water that cross-border has been subject to disagreement between 2 countries. And as an example, in 2018, Afghanistan claimed that 2,300,000,000 cubic meter flowed towards Iran, while Iran only accepted 400,000,000 cubic meters. 2022, the same, but in a much lower number, 400,000,000 cubic meter was claimed by Afghanistan, while Iran only acknowledged the receipt of 20 to 40 million cubic meter. And this is a wide gap in data. So this agreement continues to exist, but in order to address the conflict, few technical issues need to be solved. First, agreement on the annual flow of the river, based on which Iran water rights will be determined, because in below normal year, Iran will receive less water accordingly. And second, agreement should be made on the delivery of the volume of water that crossed Iran border. And agreements should also be made that during the droughts, both countries should cooperate based on the treaty and formulate plans to address these emergencies. The timing and amount of water based on the treaty also needs to be revised, and also it's subject to the realities on the ground, which recurrent droughts. But opportunities also exist. There is a legal mechanism which provides basis for data information sharing. There is no constraint in the treaty which limits the use of technological and advanced methods. Article 4 predicts the climate variance and says commissioners can agree on an alternative amount of water delivery based on when there is climate factors. But Article 11 is also very important, which says force majeure and extreme droughts. During that time, commissioners of both sides have to formulate emergency plans. While at the time of the agreement, the signing of this agreement, drought was happening every 10, 15 years. Now drought is a reality that happens every 2, 3 years in the basin. But what innovative approaches or use of technology can help addressing the issue? Data collection and monitoring is important. This technical solution can address by the innovative approaches. For example, the timeliness and accuracy of data could be improved through a greater use of automation and through rapid and reliable communication. Remote sensing GIS, this could support the existing data that could be collected through automatic sensors and automatic hydromet, for example, telemetry stations that have to be built both inside Afghanistan to measure the volume of the flow, and also across along the border to determine and measure the volume that flows towards Iran. And this could also be supported by global data sets, but the basis for that needs to be what the treaty says. That's what the countries agreed to, but are not able so far to implement. Data, and most importantly, is also about the forecasting. Hydrological modeling can be used to predict the flow, and also rate of evapotranspiration and soil moisture, and etc. This can help countries predict what the flow is and plan accordingly. Early warning systems are important, which are currently doesn't exist, and this can help reduce the human and economic causes which exacerbate the current tensions. And another important point is that data information sharing. Both countries only share data during annual or biannual meetings of the commissioners, which happens once or twice a year. This data only, as mentioned earlier, is justified to support the claims that countries makes. But through using online platforms and communication apps, countries can rapidly, frequently share real or near real-time data that could also improve understanding and prevent tensions. Flood and drought forecasting is, of course, important, and the first measure article really provides ground for both sides to look into these issues in a very constructive way and address the conflict. But while we talk about the innovative approaches, there are, of course, constraints to that. Existing political narratives is one of them. For the Taliban, their tension with Iran currently justifies their inability and lack of planning to provide people inside Afghanistan with a sustainable water supply. People in Kandahar, Helmand, and Zaran province also suffer from lack of water supplies. Similarly, in Iran, the tensions with Taliban kind of justify their mismanagement in the highly volatile, fragile, and marginalized communities in Sistan. And of course, there are more to that, but I would just move to next point. Limited capacity. Limited capacity also constrain the use of technology. And then also the question is whose data, which technology do we need, and which technology we can use. As mentioned earlier, the use of sharing of data and use of technology could also be used to blame one another. So the question is which technology that country can agree to. That is further impacted by the disparities in the capacity. Afghanistan having far less capacity than Iran would perceive that the benefits from use of this technology as not even between the two sides. And this disparity in capacity also kind of lead to lack of trust to use of this technology and innovative solutions. Naturally, when you don't know the technology and you don't know how to use it, while understanding that other party knows it's difficult to agree on that. And last but not least, financial constraints. This use of technology, of course, needs investments in terms of equipments, infrastructure, maintenance, and capacity building, which currently both countries are under sanctions. And given the financial constraints of the Taliban, this doesn't seem to be a priority investment areas. Just to end it on a positive note, I think effective cooperation requires political will, a legal framework, diplomacy, and commitment to sustainable and equitable management of water resources. Technology can enhance this effort by offering tools that can help improve our understanding, can facilitate dialogue, and also help us make informed and evidence-based decisions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mo. And the next speaker and the case study. The case study is digital water diplomacy, the role of social media and webinars in the Nile water conflict transformation. We have Mr. Jacob Barasa from the IHE Delft. Jacob Barasa Abumba is a dynamic water security and climate governance and policy expert with over 13 years of work experience, specializing in water and climate governance, policy analysis, design, implementation, and including management of water and climate change programs. So, Jacob, I hope you're online. Happy to have you with us. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to appreciate the organizers for the opportunity that they've given us to share, and also to just highlight what are the opportunities beyond what has already been highlighted. I'd like to start off by just acknowledging two things. One is the fact that with the introduction of digital tools like social media, there has been a change in how diplomacy is undertaken. The other thing is that indeed, over the years, with the introduction of these tools, we have seen that there is more diversity in terms of who is participating in decision making, how they are influencing these decisions, and how they are also targeting certain people to either support them or to be against water development, governance, and management. So the next slide, I think. Yes, so the period under the study is between 2020 to 2022. And this is a time when we see it's just about when COVID-19 had hit, and people were grappling around how do we continue with working. So most of the negotiations had to move online. The other thing is that this being the case of a Nile waters. It had been already in contestation for quite some time, and more specifically, if we can just go back to 2011, when there was it was announced that they are going to start the developments of the Nile, that is the construction of the GAD. So one of the things that we see quite crucial is that the negotiations change from objecting the construction, then the negotiations now move to filling of the dam, and then finally to operations. But one of the things that we are looking at is, yes, after operation, then what next? Could there be also possibilities of benefit sharing and burden sharing? And how is the digital platforms going to support in this? So we take note of the fact that for this particular study, one of the key things that we are looking at is who are these people on in this discussion, and that brings us to the actors we call track 3 water diplomacy actors. These are journalists, non-governmental organization officers, and also common citizens who are on social media and who will be allowed to participate in webinars and also to be very active on Twitter. And at this point, I'd like to highlight one thing, and this is a quote from Al Mohsen, which says, "Diplomacy has increasingly become complicated due to the increase in fake news, misinformation, and disinformation promoted through online narratives." Again, this is something that has already been highlighted by my previous colleagues, highlighting that indeed, with the introduction of social media into the game, then diplomacy has really changed. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, so for this study, there are three things that we looked at. Is when we talk about digital water diplomacy, what exactly do we mean? And there are three elements under digital water diplomacy that we had to bring together to concretize the framework. One is public diplomacy, where we are looking at diplomats engaging and promoting narratives through using data, and that was mainly on webinars. And for instance, under this study, we realized that both Ethiopian and Egyptian governments organized webinars to share their views and perceptions against or for the dam. The other one is media diplomacy, where we had diplomats and journalists, researchers engaging on Twitter and webinars to promote certain narratives. And this was strategically so as to build a certain support or for or against the dam. And the last one was media broker diplomacy, where journalists would organize webinars and would also have their own tweets around the Nile. And in this case, I interviewed Infonile, and they had also some webinars that where they had organized to showcase what they were doing in terms of building cooperation amongst the riparian states so that they can utilize the Nile waters sustainably. Next slide, please. So the main objective of the study was to explore the role of digital media in water conflicts, but it had only two questions. That is one, what are the narratives? And the second one is how are these narratives being used to influence conflicts transformation? Next slide. I will skip the research design and methodology, but just to highlight one thing is that it was an interdisciplinary study, and there was also context analysis just to look at what are the networks that or the messages that were being used, and then also we had to conduct a social network analysis to see who is connected to who in the spirit of sharing out wide the narratives. Next slide. So to the findings, and the reason why I had to run through is I think this is the most interesting bit, because we can now link what we have already been told by the first speaker with regards to how data is produced, and then we have seen how it's used. But now the question is, how are those who are not involved in the negotiations contributing to the decisions that are made? And this is where we see now the role of social media and webinars in water conflicts transformation and water diplomacy. Next slide. I will start by the Twitter narratives. And there were three major narratives that came out strongly. First of all was the narrative that who really owns the GAD, or who really owns the Nile. Yeah. And you realize that using hashtags, messages, and images, there will be certain narratives that will be centered around, like, for example, it's her dam. This was a narrative, this was a hashtag that was being strategically used to promote the idea that women are the ones who are going to benefit most, because currently, and like you can see in that tweet, we have an image of women carrying firewood, that they are currently suffering, walking for longer distances in search of firewood so that they can be able to cook. The other hashtag that was quite dominant was it's our dam, and this one was a little bit tricky because you cannot understand when you say it's our dam, then does it mean that it's a dam that belongs to all the riparian stuff, the riparian countries, or does it only belong to Ethiopians? But to go further and understand from where this hashtag is being used and what it really means, then you will see who are they targeting, who are they tagging, and how are they creating the story behind it. Like, for example, if it was targeted towards the Egyptian and it's like, it is our dam, then you'll see that they will also be talking about, we are the ones who are financing it, we are the ones who are building it on our own land, it's done using our own resources, so it's our dam. But also strategically, if it was about benefit sharing, then like it's our dam, and we should take note of the fact that there will be also benefits from other countries that will be getting from it, like control of flood waters, just to mention but a few. The other narrative was around gender, where the hashtag on it's her dam, its dam was being used. And normally in such cases, there will also be a target group, which will be the foreigners, because if it was only targeting the local
Jacob,
communities.
can you hear
yes,
me?
yes.
We only have 1 minute left.
Okay, then in that case, then I'll have to go to the webinar so that you can also see the what we had. So for the webinars, one critical thing that we came to realize is that the manner in which the webinars were organized is that it will only allow for the panelists to speak, but for those who are joining on, they had to either send questions or to share their comments in narrative. This could also be an issue of power dynamics and how much voice do you have as a participant or as a person who is interested in the case. Having said that, nonetheless, is that the webinars were also used to promote narratives in terms of what does it really mean to those who are interested in the case, and how they would use this information. We've already heard about information sharing and how it's important to conflicts transformation. The webinars were mostly used to share information, but most importantly was how certain images were also used in these webinars. Next slide. And like, for instance, in this particular slide, we can already see that there is a slide and it shows the GAD and the High Aswan Dam. A deeper interpretation of that will tell you that maybe perhaps one would argue that the GAD is not as big as it's shown. But again, these are just some of the elements that you can see during such cases, and also the numbers, like how much is going to be lost in terms of economic, in terms of irrigation, or how much is going to be contributed to the basin. Having said that, I'd like to conclude. Next slide. that even though we had a number of images that were being used that would indicate that women were going to be the most beneficial. From the interviews, it was also noted that the involvement of women in negotiations is still very minimal. And the question of who is speaking and who is negotiating about what is deemed as of the best interest still remains as an area of study. And how can we make sure that diplomacy, water diplomacy, is all-inclusive? Having said that, one thing that I'd like to conclude with is that with diplomatic interactions and conversations, the imagery, emotions, and the endangered expressions, they are being used online to support certain narratives. The use of Twitter and webinars by Track 3 Water Diplomacy is very pivotal. And if we take advantage of this, then we can also see how can we reduce or minimize on misinformation and disinformation. And there is need for us also to appreciate that, yes, the world is changing, and how can we also continue using these platforms to ensure that water diplomacy is more inclusive in terms of decision making, and especially more so on those who are highly and mostly impacted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Very interesting presentation. And now with the 4 sessions beneath our belts, we move into a more interactive session. Here we have a panel discussion, which will be moderated by Carl Kanter from Circle of Blue. Carl is a co-founder and director of Circle of Blue, the Center for Frontline Reporting, Research and Analysis on Water Resource Issues. He's also an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, and photojournalist whose work has appeared in remarkable magazines like National Geographic and the Time magazine. So go ahead, Carl, it's your phone.
Great. Thank you, Antti, and thank you, everybody, for being here. How many people feel like we're sitting on the edge of history, right? We're redefining it. Let me invite our panelists up here. Because we really are, from a journalistic perspective, from a human perspective, sitting in the biggest story of our time. Water, as we all know here, cuts through everything that we care about. So we really do have some exceptional panelists who are going to pick up on the provocative case studies that we had earlier. And they are helping define water's future, as we all are, and helping set our compass. And even, dare I say, a new operating system, whether you're Mac or Windows or something else. We are working in an era of undeniable, big or huge data. So we have Sam Kuzma. She's the data lead for water at WRI, and she leads development for the Aqueduct platform and global research for the Water, Peace, and Security Project. Thank you for being here. And we have Anna-Stina Heiskanen, I hope you got your name right, Unit Director and Professor of the Marine and Freshwater Solutions Unit at the Finnish Environment Institute. Among many other roles, she's a member of the Bureau in the UNECE Water Convention. And we also have Dr. Kyung-Mae Kim, a researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Institute's Climate Change and Risk Program. And her research focuses on the role of artificial intelligence, hot topic, in responding to climate-related security risks, gendered climate-related vulnerability and conflict-affected societies, and non-state armed groups' role in climate actions. Big work. And we have Dr. Sulagna Mishra, scientific officer in the Hydrology, Water, and Cryosphere branch at the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva. At WMO, she leads the State of Global Water Resources report, among other roles. And so we do want to save time for you here in the room for some questions, and also online. If we have anyone online too, those online, please put your questions in the chat. We do have quite a few tuned in, and we will be monitoring the Zoom, so please submit those questions. And when we do get the questions, we want to have a conversation and direct brief questions, not necessarily commentary. We will direct them at our panelists here. And I also want to have a conversation. So I'll invite our panelists to have a conversation among each other, not just with me and the audience here. Sulagna, I want to start with you because WMO, first off, we heard that we are in the lion's den. perhaps a bit of madness, and I hope a bit of hope and future, right? And you're in the middle of a major data initiative at WMO. So I want to hear a little bit about that, but also, again, the setup here, what are some of the big questions that you're asking as we're, in a sense, creating a digital diplomacy driven planet, water planet? Big question, right?
Thank you, Carl, and I'm glad to be in this panel with my esteemed colleagues. Yes, that's true. We are in the brink of changing. We are at the brink of history, and we all know that knowledge is power. And as Katia said in her opening, we cannot afford to be naive anymore, right? So at WMO, we encourage the sharing of data through our WMO Unified Data Policy. We also have hydrological observing system called WHOS, which helps countries to exchange data among each other, gives a platform to do that. We are also in a process of establishing a global system for a water data kind of a portal, which was also mentioned as a need of this time. So we are in the process of all of this, but what really will trigger the change is really political will. And for this, we need the information. We need to show the countries what really is the benefit of having water resources information shared, and what is the added value of having independent and large scale products, and what do they get back when they share the information. So we are in a process of developing products that showcases this benefits. So for example, we are establishing also a globally consistent water information system. So producing or helping countries to produce status information, hydrological forecast in a more standardized way, which can be interoperable. So they can also see the information from each other and take decisions based on how the resources are going to look in the next 3 to 6 months, how the resources look now, and so on. So these are some of the questions we are trying to address, and these are the initiatives we are on right now.
Great, thank you. And we'll keep an eye on that for sure. And Sam, I want to come to you because we saw some examples here today, and we heard from Solagna some of the big initiatives. But with Aqueduct and with the work that you're doing, what are some of the trends that you're spotting that you're starting to be surprised about? But then also, what are the things that we need to be thinking about with this, in a sense, data tsunami that's coming at us?
Yeah, so I'll highlight something that's been on my mind quite frequently, actually, as of late. So Aqueduct is a platform that helps us measure and monitor water challenges such as water stress, right? Competition over water resources using a global methodology. So it allows us to compare regions, to prioritize. It's, been around for over 10 years now. We have no way of tracking the decisions that are made using Aqueduct, right? So we don't know if a company has used Aqueduct to pull out of a certain region and denied that region the ability to, develop its economy. That there are no real standards for monitoring and evaluation with these frameworks. And the word that keeps coming into my head over and over, especially through these presentations, whether it's on the political scale or even as data scientists or creators of data, it's accountability. How do we have more guidance around accountability with these things? So that's something that I'm seeing come out more. We're seeing more demand for accountability, for monitoring and evaluation of these tools. And I think that this is one of the, hot topic regions that we'll see hopefully really develop and advance over the next 5 to 10 years.
Great. No, thanks. Another word too, probably is trust, right?
Yeah,
That's one that comes up all the time. How do we use this to build trust? And we heard a little bit about, we'll get to some disinformation and misinformation, how we understand and deal with that. But Quang Mei, tell me a bit about, how are these technologies potentially changing conflict prevention and peace building? Do we have some, some real, in a sense, are we making hope visible for people?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question and good point. Yes, I have been working with this topic of how AI, artificial intelligence, helps to tackle climate-related security risks, which means that the insecurities and conflicts exacerbated by climate change. So so according to a lot of the review of the existing initiatives and so on, it does look like AI can contribute to a better understanding of these risks. So how do we understand climate hazard leading to greater inequality, people's livelihood being disrupted, and also try to help humanitarian actors to better respond to this climate hazards, including, of course, a lot of has to do with water. So I think this is very relevant. So yeah, I think there is a lot of analytics that's helping to understand that risk, and also the response side, the disaster responses have been helped by better mapping of the disaster areas, damages, and so on. So I think there are many areas that can be improved with this powerful technology, but I can maybe go on about the dark side and the risk in a bit, but maybe we start with the positive.
Okay, good. And Anastina, let's come to some of those risks. I was going to have ChatGPT tune in and listen and give us a summary, but we'll probably have a much better summary at the end. And more trustworthy. But what are some of these risks? We talked about the disinformation, misinformation. What are some of the big pieces we need to be thinking about when we're talking about trust, and we're thinking about context?
Yeah, of course, the questions are very much related if the different parties that will be receiving or are able to harness the data, if they actually trust the data. So that is something that we need to have of course, the accessibility, meaning that there's also understanding of the data, which means capacity building. But on the other hand, it will also require interpretation in such a way that the different stakeholders or actors that are around the table are also able to understand the data, and also to understand the backgrounds of the information and the consequences. So it is actually starts from the monitoring, sampling, analysis, and data calculation and interpretation. And in all of those steps, we need to have a trust to the data, and also the quality control of the data. And we also need to have the quality control of the databases. So there are multiple steps which there are, of course, risks in all of those. And probably, well, I'm not an expert, but things like fake information, of course, we have that in the social media quite a lot at the moment. One other issue is citizen science, which is very much used in many countries. And also, of course, you need to have a kind of quality control and trust to the citizen science observations. And that is also kindly maybe a little bit of a risk. But on the other hand, there are good examples of platforms where citizen science or citizens can provide their information, and that can be quality controlled or checked that the citizens or what kind of an information they have. So instructions can be provided, but there are multiple steps with a lot of risks. And ultimately and finally, of course, how do you actually interpret the results? Is it like we heard in the dispute in the case of the case studies, is that the different parties might not sort of agree on the results at all, and that really requires different level of negotiations.
Great. And I want to open this, any other comments on that for our group here, because I also want to plant the seed of equity. Not every country has a supercomputer. Not everybody has access to smartphones. When we talk about citizen science, again, who controls it, who filters it? One of the most important things with citizen science is starting that conversation with citizens, right? So they do feel empowered and are part of the conversation. But what about that? What about digital equity and access to the actual technology?
If I may add to what Anna just said, of course, she mentioned very well there is the risk around uncertainty. We all know garbage in is garbage out. So what we put in is what we get out. But of course, coming to equity, I come from India. I know that several states do not have good access to computers or internet. So we also run a risk of having the information out there, but it's not reaching the right people in the right time. So not just not just having the information, we also need to have the capacity and the resources to get the information and also understand what it really means. And in terms of uncertainty, of course, models are, I did my PhD in hydrological modeling. We all know that all models are wrong, just that some models are useful. This is what my professor used to say. So we need to understand what uncertainty, what kind of uncertainty is around, and how it can be interpreted, and what it really means in terms of what decisions we are taking. So all of these risks add up, and yeah, technology is out there and has to be used, but has to be used with a pinch of salt.
Great. Sam, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll add in really quickly. I think this is such a great point, and it drives home, right, that this doesn't end with the data. Inventing a cool data set doesn't solve any problems. One way I've seen this done really well is through the Water, Peace and Security Partnership. So we, have some really cool data products, but I think the real beauty in that partnership is that implementation on the ground. There's a lot of capacity building. It's acknowledging that building a tool, even if it's global, isn't going to reach the people you need. It's not going to influence the decisions you need to influence. You have to have that next step. And so I think a framework like that, that's kind of integrating and building that bridge between global and local is essential when we're thinking about these building trust, building capacity.
Yeah, and then how do we bring that into the geopolitics? How do we make sure that we're bridging between the public and their governments, right? And then also even between competing interests. We heard a little bit about that. We want to chime in on I want to get back to the misinformation and disinformation, because I think particularly in political systems, even elections, there's a big concern. How do we address that in water? What are we worried about, and then what are some of the approaches we need to be aware of here?
I guess just a quick question. Are there any journalists in the room? Are there any diplomats? Yeah. So I think that's part of it, right? Like engage with more journalists, engage with more diplomats. We should be having them in this conference. This should be a thing, not just for water people, but for everyone. I think, reaching out of our network is a big step.
Mm-hmm.
If I may add, I think we also need to change the conversation from water being the problem of dispute to water being a solution, a peace building tool. If there is clarity from the beginning of, or we characterize and define what are the different needs of water for the different countries that are sharing it. So if someone needs it for energy and the other one needs it for agriculture and the other one for ecological demands, the problem is solved. If we really know, if we can quantify and characterize the needs of it and have a discussion around the table, I think this could be a start of a long-term collaboration. And we have seen several good examples. We have seen the SAWA Commission, the Rhine Commission, and the examples are many.
Mm-hmm. Right. And our leaders need to see themselves in the picture, right? So numbers don't always do that by themselves. Yeah, you want to jump in?
Well, I mean, I felt like at the beginning, I will be the advocate for the technology, but I feel like I want to push back on this technology-driven approaches as well, because I think water diplomacy, I think greatest lessons from the water diplomacy is water is inherently political, and we need to think about the politics and data-driven approach without political mind. I think it can also lead to quite a one-sided picture you painted. Yeah, I mean, without politics, we have no water problems, probably. So yeah, we need to think about, so who has the access to this data? Who's generating the data? What's the science? What's the politics of the science? I think these aspects needs to be considered. And I think, for example, I think AI, for example, can be a great tool for countries that do not have the climate information systems to be able to access what they need to know about their changing climate and also their weather systems. But only thinking about we can have the data that can have the best modeling, is optimization of the resources based on this technical aspects only. That's not going to solve our water problems.
Great. In about 2 minutes or so, we'll come to the audience for questions. Okay, I'll remind people again, keep questions short. We are on a very a very accelerated conversation, which could go all day. Now, Anna, Stina, you wanted to jump in.
No, I just wanted to take it back also that I'm a great believer in kind of joint inspections, that you actually take the managers to the river or wherever it is, and that people can see with their, or managers can see with their own eyes what is the situation and see how the whole process is done. So that those are extremely useful. Of course, the AI is needed there, but also the experience of the people is quite important. And often I think I have been thinking that we think that the data is neutral, or the monitoring or the chemical analysis is neutral, but who can actually access and understand the information, that is not a very neutral thing. And that brings me back to this issue of gender. So for instance, how to involve the women around the river basins or in the decision making of the transboundary rivers. And there very often is also the question that how these issues and how the data is made understandable in such a way that the kind of local people can understand and make the decisions on that. And then, of course, on the other hand, there's how to mediate the decision makers in such a way that it will aid them or help them to make the decisions. So there are also tools to assist to make the kind of decision making tools as well, which could be developed and are being used in such a situations.
Great, terrific. We're going to take a question from online. There we go.
Yes, we have one question online from Tony Sladier from the Water Policy Group to everyone here. He is asking about the accessibility of data. Many countries do not have the source data to start with, and what role can big data have in enabling basic water assessment and forecast from crowdsourced and remote source data rather than dependence on costly hydrometric equipment? So.
Who would like to take that?
I can start.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, remotely sensed data or Earth system data is being used extensively wherever data on ground in situ data is not available, especially in hydrological monitoring systems. As we know that the monitoring stations are very expensive, it might take years until we have a good coverage. So this is one of the solutions. However, it also comes with its own risk. We cannot monitor things well in the ground where there's a cloud coverage, for example, because of a shadow. Sometimes snow monitoring is not done as well when with remote sensing. It comes with a share of risks and uncertainty. But of course, this is something that we use heavily these days, and we couple it with in situ data for validation purposes. So it's not this or that, but it's we work with it together. One of the examples I would like to mention here is the WMO State of the Global Water Resources Report. What we try to show here is a quantitative assessment of the global water resources, and it gives an independent assessment of how much water is available in the different compartments. So how much stream flow is there, how much total water storage, how much soil moisture did we see in the last year in comparison to the last 30 years or last 20 years of that particular basin or catchment. And for this, we heavily depend on remotely sensed data, because global coverage of in situ data for all these components is just not there or not accessible. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And questions from the audience. And also just the journalist perspective is I'm known by friends and family to look at satellite data from Aqueduct or someone else and imagine that I could drop a pin or a golf ball off the satellite, go see where it lands, and then literally go there and see who is literally at the tip of the spear of the data and make it real and relevant. Certainly come to you. I'll try to come behind. I'll hold on. Here we go.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is very interesting presentation and discussion. I'm coming from the Nile region, and I would like to ask the question connecting the remote sensing data and the geopolitical context. For example, in the Nile, there is no data sharing because no sharing protocols, because there is no water sharing agreements. So now each country hides the data. I mean, it's part of the national security, they say. Now, data becomes freely available from satellite. Will that open the door to not hide the data, which contributes to building the trust among the countries, and hence open the door also for more cooperation? So this is my question to the panelists.
Great question. Go ahead. Who would like to take that?
Go
ahead.
no, you go first.
I can pick. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, so I think that's the potential, right? That's the hope that that data can open the door. I think we saw through some of the case studies, right, that you could also have the opposite, which is the claim and blame sort of approach, where if there's not buy-in, if there's not a mutual agreement on what data you're using, I think you still run the risk of not being able to kind of open that door. But it does make it harder to play your hand when the data is out there. If you're saying you have, you know, a lot less water than they're saying, it might be strategic for you to then share your data and actually say, actually, you know, this is what we're seeing locally. So I think it's going to depend on the context, but it's not a given.
Yeah, maybe I can add on to what Sam's saying about this. Yeah, it's difficult to hide, but I think also, for example, in the Mekong, the dam operation is at the center of the controversy because of upstream, downstream impact. And then for example, the Stimson Center has a really comprehensive initiatives to using this satellite images to generate estimation for the water flow and then giving flood warning. But then that is quite contested from the upstream country. And they, like, for example, the Mekong River Commission's this year's forum is focusing on the data and information. So I think even the satellite data that's very technically advanced, but it can still be challenged if there is a very real political and also economic interest intertwined with the situation.
Great. Okay. Lightning round. So we'll take 2 questions and throw them to the panel, and then we'll come to some closing observations here. We'll take a question here first.
Hi, I understand we're talking about technical data, but I was also thinking about qualitative data, and I'm not sure if you're able to answer it, but I'm thinking about perceived risk or perceived threat and things like that. How would you go about to get that type of information? And also, today we sometimes pay with our data, so should it be free? Maybe it shouldn't be, or is that the wrong thing to say?
Wow. Perception versus reality and the cost or free data. Think on that for 2 seconds.
My question kind of brings back the trust conversation, and we talk about trust in data. How do we build trust in our data and really understand data limitations? And so my question to you, especially in communicating uncertainty and how this data can be used, what are some ways that you see us building that trust, and how have you seen that also yourself in your work?
Okay, lightning round, quick answers. I'd like to take that on.
Okay. Perception versus reality, and this is the reason why we really need a standardized way to interpret the data. So to make sure that everyone has the same perspective or understands the same data in the same way, we need a standardized method. And this is where indicators can come in, which are calculated in a prescribed way. And even if countries are, because of different sensitivities, are not already in a position to share the hydrological data, what they could share is the indicators, or share the perspectives and the decisions of the different countries which are sharing the shared water resources, they can take actions accordingly. So this could be one of the options to make sure that the perspectives are right.
Sam, you want to say, or go ahead.
If you want to. Yeah, no, it's about the uncertainty issue, which is of course a very difficult issue because there's uncertainty, there's bias in different stages of the data option. But there are, of course, tools to look at the uncertainty. And for instance, I'm a big believer, for instance, in comparison of the different methodologies. For instance, if there are 2 different models which can slightly give a different results, those should be compared between the countries. So this kind of an expert cooperation or scientist cooperation to compare the data and come into conclusion can be very fruitful in the sense that there is an uncertainty. And of course, uncertainty is related to the risk, to the consequences. So what kind of risks there are if the uncertainty is very big. So we always talk about this, that maybe if the risks are really big, one should do actions in any case, even if there's a big uncertainty. So if the costs are to be expected are great, so that also need to be part of the evaluation.
Great. And we have a real-time data update. We have a couple more minutes. So I'll come to a question here, but Sam, you wanted to.
Yeah, I was going to jump in on the cost question because I actually think this is such an important thing to be talking about. It's great to say open source is, is everything, but the realities are data costs money to make, it costs data to host, to maintain all of those things, right? And what we see is interest in investing in an initial data set, but no interest in the continuation or longevity of data. How do you build trust in a data set if every data set disappears in 3 years? How do you use data to monitor, to build around negotiations if you can't trust that it's going to be there? And so I think we have to have a real frank discussion about the costs of open source data.
Yeah, and the irony there too is it takes a lot of water to cool data centers as well.
So my question is, what proactive measures or thoughts you might be having in sharing that data, in empowering civil society to use that data to advance water diplomacy. And an example between Gaza and Israel that Ecopeace has used of satellite imagery of vast quantities of sewage leaving Gaza, closing down desalination plants in Israel that facilitate then the World Bank completing sewage treatment plants back in Gaza. So, but that satellite imagery is released almost by accident, while if there was a more proactive approach, perhaps that information could have come out earlier. And I think of other perhaps less powerful NGOs that would never get access to that information in the first place.
I'd like to jump in on that. And then I'll bring it back to Antti to go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question totally, but of course, coming back to for instance, the Water Convention and the transboundary Water Convention, we need joint bodies, we need agreements, and those would be the kind of the basis, of course. And my experience is that using the data and coming finally into some political conclusion takes a lot of time and a lot of meetings. So really the part of the negotiations and organizing that process through the established agreements and commissions is very crucial. Also to have the legislation and joint bodies. So it's the whole package that needs to be there.
Just to reflecting on this empowering civil societies, this is not really the same as sharing information, but I mean, for example, the UN country teams in Libya and Yemen, they have done this large participant involved stakeholder consultations with the basically the large language model like responses. So people will just log into their internet. I think there was something like 2,000 people just did the consultation at the same time. So they could give what they care about the peace. So this was a part of the peace, like a mediation effort to sort of take in all the stakeholder input for the peace negotiation that was aided by the UN. So for example, I think for conflict, like if there's a tension over water, I think civil society can perhaps organize a consultation meeting that can actually bring in a lot of stakeholders, which can be done with this type of responsive AI-based systems. So they could also open some doors for civil society to gain more grassroots support.
Great. Well, I want to say thank you on behalf of everybody here to our great panel. Thank you so much. Let me hand it off to Antti.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think it was a fantastic panel. So I release you. So we have 2 more colleagues coming up. We might be running 1 or 2 minutes over time. I hope you don't leave. And I say immediately that, this is not the end of it. The Lions then goes to C4 tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So I think it's a little bit smaller room. So be in time to get your seat. But that's when things are going to be wrapped up and discussed more. So today's discussion we wrap up in a manner that we get two colleagues here on the podium to discuss. We have Mrs. Sara Todorovic. She is a researcher and a project coordinator at the Finnish Environment Institute. Sara coordinates Joint Ministerial Water Diplomacy Project, where she supports the planning and implementation of our water diplomacy activities. Sara, please come up. And we also have Aaron Salzberg. He is currently the director of the Water Institute at the University of North Carolina, and formerly served as the first special coordinator for water at the US Department of State. So two great colleagues here today.
Thanks, Antti, and thank you, everybody. And you know, we're not going to try to summarize the entire conversation, but I think we've got a great opportunity to reflect a little bit on some of the things that we heard today. And Sara, I'd love to hear from you about what your takeaways from today's discussion are.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank everyone.
Sure.
Oh, is it on now? Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone, first of all, for this very interesting and inspiring discussion. I certainly learned a lot. And because this topic of digital diplomacy is very timely, and I'm sure that everyone in this room and online got some food for thought. And so this afternoon, we really dived into how the landscape of transboundary cooperation and water diplomacy is evolving due to digital technologies. And so during the interesting keynote speech we had in the beginning and the presentations and the panel discussion by the leading experts in the field, we got just a glimpse of how Earth observation, the internet and its digital platforms, social media, GIS analysis, data analytics, AI in its different forms, and many others are basically transforming everything from the civil society interactions to water and conflict management practices and policymaking as well. But even more so, just as in this panel we heard, there are many critical questions related to the use of this technology in diplomacy. And I'm genuinely inspired by the diverse examples that we discovered. But while the speakers emphasized the opportunities that these technologies offer, they also discussed some of the main risks they introduce. So Aaron, what would some of these opportunities and challenges be?
Yeah, I think you covered a lot of the great opportunities, right? The idea, and we heard this from Kyung-Mi just a minute ago, how you can engage stakeholders in new and creative ways, how you can actually get information from a wider variety of sources. We saw, you know, the one example that Faizi mentioned around force majeure, something we don't often talk about. This is a term that's in almost every single contract that exists around the world in water. And the idea of how you define that, especially with climate change, the impacts of climate change is critically important. And actually it triggers a whole series of other actions of, you know, when the party is responsible, when they're not responsible. This idea that we now have tools to better understand some of those limits, I think is incredibly important. But I'm also with some of the skeptics here. I worry. And we heard this, I think, from Andestina. We also heard this from at the very beginning, from Nadja as well, but this idea that data is not neutral. And the data dissemination process is not neutral. This idea that Samantha raised where, you know, a company might look at their website and make a decision not to fund a plant in a particular area based on the data that they saw on that website. You know, that brings a huge set of responsibilities on parties who are producing data. And this idea, and it came up in with a number of the speakers, but I like the way, you know, Adam raised this as well too, how even data is presented, even if it's the same data. The way you present it and the way it looks can influence a political process and can influence public and political opinions about what's going on. And so there's this huge responsibility to bring in other sets of actors. The question over here about, you know, perceptions, because 9 times out of 10, we're dealing with people's perceptions of what's going on and not the reality of what's going on. And we have to understand and address those perceptions at the same time in a political process, because that's often what drives politics. And so how do you do that qualitative research to understand those perceptions, while at the same time looking at the true data to understand the reality and bring those things together in a thoughtful way in a process that allows you to move forward. And so now all of a sudden you're talking about not just digital diplomacy, and I thought we had a great presentation on that and how you begin to think about integrating those tools into what you've got, but how do you as diplomats develop the skill sets to bring these things in properly. I'm looking at Anders. Look, you've got a hard task, right? You've got a facility that's going to address these issues. You're going to have a whole social media platform or leg or pillar of these efforts. And how do we be very deliberative in our transboundary processes about how we introduce data and ensure that that introduction process is managed, that expectations are managed, and that you just don't dump things on countries that could be destabilizing or politically disruptive?
Yeah, exactly. So basically embracing technology and water diplomacy is a dual challenge. So on one hand, you need to address the downsides and then seize the upsides on the other hand. And so we heard that the potential is massive, but as we have learned today, but it's really up to us to make sure that this technological wave doesn't leave anyone behind. And to really make sure of this, we need collaboration. So we need governments, we need innovators, companies, researchers, local and global communities, which were also mentioned, to really work together to achieve this equitable and responsible, transparent, inclusive tech integration. And this is really important in today's world, as Antti mentioned in the very beginning of this geopolitical turbulence, and especially when working in fragile contexts, as we learned from the case examples.
So can I ask you a question? Because you're a young professional, you're just starting out, you've been working on GIS and you're developing some of these technologies. Does this conversation influence the way you think about how you're going to have to develop your career going forward and the skill sets you're going to need to develop to be actively engaged in this sector?
Well, the short answer is of course. And all these questions that were raised in this discussion, the panel, they're really relevant for all of us who are engaged in anything related to data and water diplomacy or any other natural resource or anything actually that's going on in this world today. But I'd like to highlight finally that discussions that we've had today are really like puzzle pieces in this more broader image of the policy implications that tech use has, which is actually the topic of tomorrow's session. So I hope that everyone will join that session as well, because the conversation really doesn't end here. We just raised the questions.
So we'll turn it back to Antti, but again, join us tomorrow and we're going to continue this discussion as we move more to the political side of this question. So Antti, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Aaron and Sarah. I don't know if I have ever been in a Stockholm Water Week session. I've been coming 14 years here, and I don't think I've been in a session where I see two people leaving the room and the other one returning. Thank you for that, Anders. So, there are a lot of takeaway messages, but I think one sentence I picked up was that we need to understand what the data means. And immediately I was also thinking that what type of sort of a discussion and platform or narrative do we need to get that message and meaning to those people who work with diplomacy and security issues? Because those are the people who actually do the decisions, not the water people, which I suppose most of us are. So, I think a lot of people put a lot of work into this. I know Kira and Sarah are online somewhere in Finland. A lot of great colleagues here in the room. So, and the speakers. So let's show a little bit of appreciation to everyone. And as said, tomorrow at 2:00 C4, we are trying to get this somehow wrapped up. Thank you.